Welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'll continue my conversation on Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So, if you watched the previous lectures, we are on chapter 3, which he started by describing what he means by a dialogue, which he then implies that education needs to be dialogic. Then, in order to understand how best to serve the people that you're trying to educate, he teaches us about the concept of the thematic universe in which people exist, and then learning of varied thematic universes, generative themes within which people exist. So in today's reading, he is now approaching a method, right? And the method is the way for us as teachers and as people to ascertain what kind of themes do we exist in, and then developing a method of looking at those themes in a critical way, not from the point of view of the researcher or the teacher, but also in a critical way from the point of view of the people who are caught within a given thematic universe. So the idea is, how do we study and become aware of any given theme or sub-theme within which we live? How do we learn how it connects with other themes? Because without that, we cannot develop a kind of pedagogy which is not top-down but informed by people's lived experience and their understanding of that lived experience within the given thematics of any social space or any culture. So that is what we'll be discussing today, and it is from page 105 till 108, bottom of page 108. So as always, I'll first read and then come and briefly talk about the reading. So here we go with the first reading. In the events, however, that human beings perceive reality as dense, impenetrable, and enveloping, it is indispensable to proceed with the investigation by means of abstraction. This method does not involve reducing the concrete to the abstract, which would signify the negation of its dialectical nature, but rather maintaining both elements as opposites which interrelate dialectically in the act of reflection. This dialectical movement of thought is exemplified perfectly in the analysis of a concrete existential coded situation. Its decoding requires moving from the abstract to the concrete. This requires moving from the part to the whole and then returning to the parts. This in turn requires that the subject recognize himself in the object, the coded concrete existential situation, and recognize the object as a situation in which he finds himself, together with other subjects. If the decoding is well done, this movement of flux and reflux from the abstract to the concrete, which occurs in the analysis of a coded situation, leads to the supersedence of the abstraction by the critical perception of the concrete, which has already ceased to be a dense, impenetrable reality. When an individual is presented with a coded existential situation, a sketch or photograph which leads by abstraction to the concreteness of existential reality, his tendency is to split that coded situation. In the process of decoding, this separation corresponds to the stage we call the description of the situation, and facilitates the discovery of the interaction amongst the parts of the disjointed whole. This whole, the coded situation, which previously had been only diffusely apprehended, begins to acquire meaning as thought flows back to it from the various dimensions. Since, however, the coding is the representation of an existential situation, the decoder tends to take the step from the representation to the very concrete situation in which and with which she finds herself. It is thus possible to explain conceptually why individuals begin to behave differently with regard to objective reality once that reality has ceased to look like a blind alley and has taken on its true aspect, a challenge which human beings must meet. In all the stages of decoding, people exteriorize their view of the world, and in the way they think about and face the world, fatalistically, dynamically, or statically, their generative themes may be found. A group which does not concretely express a generative thematics, a fact which might appear to imply the non-existence of themes, is, on the contrary, suggesting a very dramatic theme, the theme of silence. The theme of silence suggests a structure of mutism in face of the overwhelming force of the limit situations. I must re-emphasize that the generative themes cannot be found in people divorced from reality, nor yet in reality divorced from people, much less in no man's land. It can only be apprehended in the human-world relationship. To investigate the generative theme is to investigate people's thinking about reality and people's action upon reality, which is their praxis. For precisely this reason, the methodology proposed requires that the investigators and the people, who would normally be considered objects of the investigation, should act as co-investigators. The more active an attitude men and women take in regard to the exploration of their thematics, the more they deepen their critical awareness of reality, and in spelling out those thematics, take possession of that reality. Some may think it inadvisable to include the people as investigators in the search for their own meaningful thematics, that their intrusive influence, the intrusion of those who are most interested or ought to be in their own education, will adulterate the findings and thereby sacrifice the objectivity of the investigation. This view mistakenly presupposes that themes exist in their original objective purity outside people, as if themes are things. Actually, themes exist in people in their relations with the world, with reference to concrete facts. The same objective fact could evoke different complexes of generative themes in different epochal subunits. There is therefore a relation between the given objective fact, the perception women and men have of this fact, and the generative themes. So there are quite a few instructive things in the passages that I just read. The most important thing to keep in mind is that we are now trying to devise a method of ascertaining a given thematics of any space and then the sub-generative thematics within that. But we are not trying to do that as outsiders coming in and researching an area. We are trying to develop that in concert and collaboration with the very people that we are trying to serve. And that is why he goes into this coding and decoding of a given message. Now, do keep in mind that both Freire and his wife were very much into art education, and they did use art to teach and also to practice the same theory that he is trying to explain over here. So when he says that people are given a chance to look at abstraction of the real life, what they are talking about is pictures, right? In any given situation. A picture is an abstract representation of the real. But while discussing the picture, people see themselves in it, think of it critically, and then take that knowledge to the real life. So there is this dialogic relationship between the abstract and the real. It's kind of a hermeneutic move, but not just within the text of the coded message. The message must become a clue to the real. So this is the movement that he's talking about. And in the process, the hope is that while looking at the abstract representation of the real, people who come in touch with it, in conversation with, let's say, the teachers or researchers, will then dismantle, right, the sign and start looking at the world differently and their own place in it. Now, there is a reference to mutism, and that's where he's suggesting that, look, some people may not have any opinions. Now, that does not mean that they don't live in a given epochal or regional thematic universe. What that means is that the thematic under which they are is the one that mutes them, that silences them. Right? There are a few other instructive things that he teaches us in these passages. And the most important of them all is that any given generative thematics does not exist by itself as a thing that you go and find. It expresses itself in people's lives. So we cannot read a generative thematics without people, right? And people exist within a generative thematic. So an exact or a better reading of that situation would involve both the people and the thematics and then their critical engagement with it. That's a very important point to keep in mind, because then it tells us that most of the times when sociologists go and study an area or a community, if they are only reading the symptoms and not necessarily discussing it with the people, then they are assuming that a certain system exists outside of life itself. And if they could find it, they could then define the people themselves. Here, the most crucial thing to keep in mind is that throughout this process, what we are trying to develop is a pedagogical praxis which is transformative. In order to do that, we abstract in pictures, in stories, a given reality, and then people come to it, read it, talk about it, reflect on the abstract form itself, but then go and think about the real form. And he says that that doesn't change the thematic itself, but it changes the perception of the thematic for the people who are engaging with it. So the first step then is to make people who are co-investigators with you and not the objects of your investigation aware of their own thematic in which they exist. And the process is by confronting it in an abstract form, in a pictorial form, in a story, discussing it, and then people realizing themselves as to what their place is within the art itself, right? But what their place is in the world, and that then creates a kind of research into the thematics, which is not top-down, but which is informed by the very people who are participants in that given thematics, whose lives are determined by it. And that is one of the most crucial lessons in this section that I just read. Let's go on and read some more, and then I'll come and talk to you about it. A meaningful thematics is expressed by people, and a given moment of expression will differ from an earlier moment if they have changed their perception of the objective facts to which the themes refer. From the investigator's point of view, the important thing is to detect the starting point at which the people visualize the given, and to verify whether or not during the process of investigation any transformation has occurred in their way of perceiving reality. Objective reality, of course, remains unchanged. If the perception of that reality changes in the course of the investigation, that fact does not impair the validity of the investigation. We must realize that the aspirations, the motives, and the objectives implicit in the meaningful thematics are human aspirations, motives, and objectives. They do not exist out there somewhere as static entities. They are occurring. They are as historical as human beings themselves. Consequently, they cannot be apprehended apart from them. To apprehend these themes and to understand them is to understand both the people who embody them and the reality to which they refer. But precisely because it is not possible to understand these themes apart from people, it is necessary that those concerned understand them as well. Thematic investigation thus becomes a common striving towards awareness of reality and towards self-awareness, which makes this investigation a starting point for the educational process or for cultural action of a liberating character. The real danger of the investigation is not that the supposed objects of the investigation, discovering themselves to be co-investigators, might adulterate the analytical results. On the contrary, the danger lies in the risk of shifting the focus of the investigation from the meaningful themes to the people themselves, thereby treating the people as objects of the investigation. Since this investigation is to serve as a basis for developing an educational program in which teachers, and students' teachers combine their cognitions of the same object, the investigation itself must likewise be based on reciprocity of action. Thematic investigation, which occurs in the realm of the human, cannot be reduced to a mechanical act. As a process of search, of knowledge, and thus of creation, it requires the investigators to discover the interpenetration of problems in the linking of meaningful themes. The investigation will be most educational when it is most critical, and most critical when it avoids the narrow outlines of partial or focalized views of reality and sticks to the comprehension of total reality. Thus, the process of searching for the meaningful thematics should include a concern for the links between themes, a concern to pose these themes as problems, and a concern for their historical cultural context. Just as the educator may not elaborate a program to present to the people, neither may the investigator elaborate itineraries for researching the thematic universe, starting from points which he has predetermined. Both education and the investigation designed to support it must be sympathetic activities in the etymological sense of the word. That is, they must consist of communication and of the common experience of reality perceived in the complexity of its constant becoming. The investigator who, in the name of scientific objectivity, transforms the organic into something inorganic, what is becoming into what is, life into death, is a person who fears change. He or she sees in change, which is not denied but neither is it desired, not a sign of life but a sign of death and decay. He or she does want to study change, but in order to stop it, not in order to stimulate or deepen it. However, in seeing change as a sign of death and in making people the passive objects of investigation in order to arrive at rigid models, one betrays their own character as a killer of life. I repeat, the investigation of thematics involves the investigation of the people's thinking which occurs only in and among people together seeking out reality. I cannot think for others or without others, nor can others think for me. Even if people's thinking is superstitious or naive, it is only as they rethink their assumptions in action that they can change, producing and acting upon their own ideas, not consuming those of others, must constitute that process. Okay, once again, highly instructive passages. We are right into the heart of what Freire is trying to teach us, and that is to develop a problem-solving mode of teaching, right? In order to do that, he introduced us to the concept of a generative thematics within which we all exist. And what he's saying is, before you even plan a program of education, you must study the meaningful thematic within which people exist. But you cannot study it as an inert body that exists out there. The thematic actually is part of people's lives, right? And people must decipher it. Because the purpose of this plan is to create a kind of educational model that initiates and sustains change. So if you're a researcher who's afraid of change and wants to maintain the status quo, you will be not the kind of teacher that Freire is trying to train. Now, in order to understand a thematic, then what he's saying is that people must be involved in it, right? They must think through it, they must think about it critically, and they must work together with the researcher in discussing and deciphering any given thematics. Another thing to keep in mind is that you can't just study one thematic here and one over here. You must study the totality of the system in which various generative thematics exist because they are interconnected. So this interconnectedness is a huge part of it. So overall, when we have abstracted the reality, looked at it critically, and gone back to the reality has not changed yet. We haven't set upon that task yet. But we must first change the perception of that reality and our own place in it and people's place in it. But that cannot be taught top down, that they must learn in the process of this investigation as co-investigators. Now, when we do that, then what have we learned? We have found out what is the meaningful thematics of a given space, how is it connected to other epochal or regional thematics. And when we have found that out, then along with the people, we can devise a problem solving and a problem posing mode of education. Now let's just see what examples could we use. Let's say you go into an urban poor community. Maybe they have a thematics of muteness. They have internalized that this is their place in life. They don't deserve better. And if you offer them a picture of a world in which you show them and other people who are affluent, maybe they'll see it as natural. But when we start discussing that picture, to start discussing that story, it will make them aware of the dichotomy within the picture, right? Within the story. And then we take that story to their lived conditions and they think about it critically. And in the process, they then realize their own place in that given thematic of an hierarchical order in which they are poor. Now, this isn't just about education as I read it. I mean, keep in mind that the struggle in Marxism has always been how would workers become aware of their own exploitation. But there was no didactics for it. Some people thought that, a vanguard would emerge and they will train the other workers. The others thought that the Communist Party would do that. But here, what Freire is doing is actually a didactics aimed at figuring out what the given of everyone's life is, or what they believe to be the given. Then an attempt at involving them in discussing the very given and see how it is structured. And then, with that reflection, developing a mode of research and pedagogy that is transformative, that enables people to articulate the system in which they exist and then change it, transform it into what he has already promised us in the beginning of the book, a world in which everyone can realize their full human potential. So that's all for this section. I'll come back with more. I hope this was useful to you. If I missed anything, feel free to post a question in the comments and I'll try to answer this or any of your questions. And I will be back with the next segment in our series on Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Thank you so much. Stay safe, take care of each other, and as always, peace and love.